Morning, everyone. I'm Melanie Blow, Communication Strategist for the Rochester Regional Coalition Against Human Trafficking and the Chief Operations Officer of the Stop Abuse campaign. I want to thank you all for coming on this incredibly busy and eventful day in the middle of a very busy and eventful month and year. Thank you. Thank you. To start out this proclamation event, I want to introduce the chair of the Rochester Regional Coalition Against Human Trafficking, Dr. Celia McIntosh.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you and hello. Today we come together to recognize January as National Slavery and Human Trafficking Prevention and Awareness Month. Last year made 20 years since the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 when it was enacted by Congress. This was a critical step in the global fight against human trafficking. This legislation established methods for prosecuting traffickers, preventing human trafficking, and protecting victims and survivors of trafficking. As many of you may know, human trafficking is our modern-day slavery, a hidden crime that knows no boundaries. There are two forms of human trafficking: sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Worldwide, children, women, and men are exploited by way of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of commercial sex, debt bondage, and involuntary labor. But a common misconception is that trafficking is a foreign epidemic, but thanks to the momentum of education and awareness, we are coming to recognize that it exists within the United States, and yes, here in our Rochester community. In fact, in 2019, Rochester Center for Youth Services received over 200 referrals from police, medical officials, and local agencies about youth who had been sexually exploited. Of those, 70 youth acknowledged that they had been sold for sex. Human trafficking is the fastest growing and second largest criminal industry in the world. It is estimated that this industry generates over $150 billion annually, which is more than Nike, Starbucks, and Google combined. All trafficking victims share one essential experience: the loss of freedom. Despite this knowledge, the demand continues to grow and human trafficking continues to be underrecognized and underreported. Since 2007, the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline received more than 63,000 calls in the United States, and of those, over 9,000 were from the great state of New York, which ranks fourth in the highest call volume to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. We know this is likely a gross underestimation given the hidden nature of the crime. The global COVID-19 pandemic has generated new vulnerabilities and have rendered millions of people vulnerable to exploitation and human trafficking. With new public social mandates like social distance guidelines, shelter-in-place orders, school and business closure, event meeting cancellations, expanded online communication, increased unemployment, poverty, increased homelessness, and vulnerability leads to new strategies for recruiting or marketing victims, and now a risk of exposure to COVID-19. Human trafficking is a much bigger problem than traffickers. All of these social changes will likely increase the prevalence of human trafficking. Trafficking victims often are forced into substandard housing or work in crowded, unsafe conditions, have little access to healthcare, PPE, or other tools that help decrease risk mitigation, or help tools to decrease risk mitigation, have co-occurring mental health and substance abuse issues that further compromise their ability to fight off diseases. Individuals with the least control over their lives have the least control over their health and hit harder by the infectious disease and can serve as reservoirs. The Rochester Regional Coalition Against Human Trafficking calls out trafficking in persons as a global public health problem, a violation to basic human rights, and a crime against humanity. During National Slavery and Human Trafficking Prevention Month and throughout the year, Rochester Regional Coalition Against Human Trafficking will continue to fight to end trafficking. In response to this increased incidence of human trafficking reports within the greater Rochester community, RCAT was formed in 2013 as a coordinated response to the needs of human trafficking victims. What started out with a couple nonprofits and individuals now includes many across the community spectrum, including Angels of Mercy, Bright Star Community, Church Women United, National Council of Jewish Women, Sisters of St. Joseph's, the Stop Abuse Campaign, Worldwide Documentaries, the Vignelli Center for Design Studies at RIT, Willow Domestic Violence Center, and St. John Fisher College Wegman School of Nursing. In addition to these groups, many individuals give their uncompensated time to RCAT simply because they refuse to do nothing. RCAT is dedicated to eliminating human trafficking in our communities through education, advocacy, networking with individuals and organizations. So to put our words of our mission into action, we developed the Yes Here campaign. Last year, to foster awareness throughout Monroe County, we utilized RTS Insight cards to display our message. RCAT is a leader in education and awareness, aiming to educate the community and make visible the problem of human trafficking in upstate New York. This year, we had to pivot and develop a YouTube channel in addition to expanding our footprint through social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and our website to really increase our reach so we can educate our community about the atrocities of human trafficking. Another mainstay of RCAT is our Care Pack initiative. Our goal is to help victims by providing them with essentials like toiletries, quarters, combs, snacks, and warm blankets. We organize community groups that collect supplies, assemble them in packs, and distribute them to outreach communities. Another thing that we have also done in 2020 was to start a survivor fund. And since starting that survivor fund, we have been able to help 4 different individuals that have been at risk or been trafficked. So I will turn it over to Melanie for the next portion of our program.
Thank you, Celia. At this point, I'd like to call up some legislators who'd like to speak.
I am pleased to be here this morning. I've joined this meeting for several years and am just overwhelmed by what we learned today and appreciate you doing this. I've done lots of resolutions and proclamations over my term with Senator Galvin, and this is the first time I've done it remotely, so we'll give it a shot. This is a resolution that has 13 whereas paragraphs, and I will only read 2 of them. And it says, whereas National Human Trafficking Awareness Day is recognized each year on January 11th, in recognition of this important day, Blue Campaign hosts a social media campaign called Wear Blue Day. Whereas Human Trafficking Awareness Month was implemented to raise awareness among Americans that human trafficking does not just happen in other countries, but in states and communities across the United States. It is resolved that this legislative body pause in its deliberations to memorialize Governor Andrew M. Cuomo to proclaim January 11th, 2021 as Wear Blue Day in the state of New York, in conjunction with the observance of National Slavery and Human Trafficking Prevention Month, and it is further resolved that a copy of this resolution suitably engrossed be transmitted to the Honorable Andrew M. Cuomo, Governor of the great state of New York.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ann. Next up, I would like to introduce Brighton Town Supervisor Bill Mole.
Thank you for having me here this morning. Like Ann, I have been now several years in a row to this event, and it's an important message. I want to thank you, Dr. McIntosh, for all you do to keep this message out there. And in terms of messaging, I don't think anything could be any clearer than those 2 little words you use year after year to remind people this is not someone else's problem. This is our problem. Yes, here. Yes, here in New York, in upstate New York, and yes, here in Brighton. So we will all work together. So many great organizations you have to work collectively to bring resolution to this terrible, terrible issue of human trafficking and slavery. I will read this proclamation. Whereas human trafficking is a modern form of slavery, involving the use of force, fraud, or coercion to exploit people for labor, domestic servitude, or commercial sex acts. And whereas an estimated 26 million adults and children of all ages, races, and socioeconomic backgrounds are victimized in countries around the world. And whereas there is no evidence that traffickers are more likely to be of a particular race, nationality, gender, or sexual orientation, they may be family members, romantic partners, acquaintances, or strangers. And whereas the US National Human Trafficking Hotline reports that the majority of trafficking is in the commercial sex trade and disproportionately impacts women and girls, with over 22,000 victims and survivors identified in the US alone in 2019. Whereas the town of Brighton supports the efforts being made by law enforcement, advocacy organizations, faith communities, and others, both locally and around the world, to prevent human trafficking and protect survivors of human trafficking. Now therefore be it proclaimed that I, William W. Maley, Brighton Town Supervisor, do hereby declare January 11, 2021 to be National Slavery and Human Trafficking Prevention Day in the town of Brighton, and use this opportunity to make all members of our community aware of the evils of human trafficking, so that trafficking and slavery are stopped and that victims are given justice and freedom. Yes, here. And this proclamation is signed this 11th day of January 2021 by myself, William Maley, Brighton Town Supervisor. I'll hold it up if you can see it. Thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you for the work you do.
Thank you for being here. We thank the town of Brighton as well. Thank you.
Next up, I would like to introduce Dr. Jen Feliciano.
Yeah, good morning. I am here representing City Council, the City of Rochester City Council, and I'm so thankful for the opportunity. Actually, in my years serving in Indonesia, was able to work with an organization called Hands That Heal, and was able to meet survivors of human trafficking and work with some organizations there. So this is a real honor for me. I'll just read the City Council Office Proclamation. Whereas National Human Trafficking Awareness Day was first observed in 2011 when President Barack Obama signed the Presidential Proclamation of National Slavery and Human Trafficking Prevention Month, drawing attention to the atrocities faced by people across the globe. And whereas for the untold numbers of individuals who are trafficked and exploited every year, coerced into sex work, forced and tricked into unsafe labor, and subjugated by those they trusted to help them, today is a day to recognize their plight, to honor and support the survivors and use their voices and join the call to action. And whereas no community is immune, each year in Monroe County, hundreds of individuals face traffickers, their detrimental impact often hidden from the public eye. Yet thanks to groups like the Rochester Regional Coalition Against Human Trafficking, its member organizations and service providers, those affected by trafficking are provided a safety net of care and connected, supportive staff who understand how this trauma has changed them and who will work with them to bring their lives back to normalcy. And whereas as a community, we must make ourselves more aware of the warning signs of human trafficking, we must be willing to report a situation when there is concern that injustice is taking place. We must be conscientious consumers and learn about where and how the products we use are made. And whereas locally, tremendous efforts are underway to support those impacted by trafficking. In 2013, the Rochester Human Trafficking Court was created, and last year it expanded its services to include the towns and villages in Monroe County We know that the coalition will advocate for policy and programs that will benefit those who have experienced trafficking, and we will continue to support those efforts. Now, therefore, we, Mayor Lovely A. Warren, we, Council President Loretta C. Scott, Council President Willie J. Lightfoot, and Council members Malik D. Evans, Mitch Gruber, Lachey D. Harris, Mary Lupian, Miguel A. Melendez Jr., Michael A. Patterson, and Jose Pio of the City of Rochester do hereby proclaim January 11th, 2021 to be a call to awareness for National Human Trafficking Awareness Day. Thank you.
Thank you. And we thank the City of Rochester as well.
Yes, thank you. Ernest Flagler, would you care to say a few words?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Dr. McIntosh, and the entire staff that is behind bringing awareness to human trafficking. I believe this here is a very important issue that should remain on the table. This country ain't just started finding out that human trafficking has been taking place. I mean, since 1619, when the first slaves was brought over, they were separated from their families, and you know the whole premise was for work and sex labor. Then after we got out of the slave era, we went into the Black Codes era, where you know, many people were being falsely accused, kidnapped from home, put on chain gangs, family members who we all never seen again, just to find out that they died on a chain gang for crimes they was accused of that they never did. And then we went on to the civil rights era, where once again people have been stolen from their family, like rented out to do jobs to pay off debts for the sharecropping era. And then we have today human trafficking, where you talk about sex and labor, and it's become more and more prevalent in this country, that we continue to keep awareness, and organizations such as this continue to fight and advocate for us to create policies and laws that can bring those to justice that do these heinous acts. And so I am happy to represent the Black and Asian Democratic Caucus and in support of this great organization and all the organizations who are fighting against human trafficking here in Monroe County. Thank you very much. And may God bless you.
Thank you as well. Really appreciate you.
Thank you very much for that. Patricia Stevens, would you like to say a few words?
I'm the recreation supervisor in the town of Rush, and the Rush Town supervisor and one of the council ladies, that's Phyllis Wickerham, who also attends this meeting, said that I should come and find out more about the human trafficking, because I do have contact with all the families in the town of Rush. But thank you for allowing me to attend your meeting and listen in and find out more about it. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Patricia, for being here.
Yep. Oh, you're very welcome. Well, thank you. George McNerney, representing Chris Jacobs' office. Would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you having our office on. Again, my name is George McNerney. I'm the District Director for Congressman Jacobs. The Congressman, we just want to extend a huge thank you to the Rochester Regional Coalition for your advocacy and bringing awareness to what is a very important issue to this area. Congressman Jacobs represents a good portion of the U.S.-Canadian border and certainly understands the challenges this area in particular faces when it comes to combating human trafficking. He also wanted me to pass along that whatever capacity our office can be helpful in, whether it's working with local agencies or coalitions like yourself to curb human trafficking, we will be there to assist you in that. And then I know I had sent one over. We don't usually do the resolutions with whereases, but the Congressman just wanted to had a accommodation put together, and so on behalf of Congressman Jacobs and the U.S. House of Representatives, he wanted to pass it along as a in recognition of not only what this day is, but also just in recognition to all the advocacy and what you guys do for the area in terms of bringing awareness to human trafficking. So thank you.
Thank you, George, and thank you to Congressman Jacobs as well.
Yes, thank you so much. Amanda Balling, would you care to say a few words?
Morning, everyone. I know it says Callie Marionetti. Oh, thank you for fixing that. I am Amanda Balling, the Deputy Chief of the Special Victims Unit, and I'm here representing Sandra Dorley and the Monroe County District Attorney's Office. I sit on the Western District Human Trafficking Task Force, and we are doing important work as an office with the Human Trafficking Court and bringing awareness to ADAs that don't necessarily focus on special victims crimes. We did a training to bring in narcotics prosecutors and violent felony prosecutors, as well as misdemeanor prosecutors, to teach them to recognize the signs of human trafficking and what resources are available to them. So I thank you so much for the important work that you're doing in our community, and we look forward to continuing our partnership and fighting this battle with all of you. So thank you for allowing me to be here.
Thank you for coming. We're very grateful.
Thank you, Amanda.
I want to thank everybody who I appreciate so much. So many people have come to speak out about this issue that is so unpleasant to talk about, so unpleasant to think about. So many of you are taking time out of your very, very busy schedules in a remarkably busy year, month, week, chapter in Western civilization to come and talk with us about this. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your concern. Thank you for your willingness to listen. We appreciate it so much, and you are doing so much to help the most vulnerable in this community. And now I'd like to turn this over to Dr. McIntosh again for a few closing remarks.
Thank you, Melanie. So what we know is that human trafficking exists because our societal structures allow it. Injustices such as sexism, classism, racism, and abuse are foundational to human trafficking. As a healthcare provider, I know all too well that in order to address the symptom, you cannot just simply put a Band-Aid on it. We must address it from the root. This is how we need to address human trafficking as a serious problem that requires active attention and collaboration. So again, I echo what Melanie's saying, and thank everyone for being here today during this unprecedented time. Today, January 11th, 2021, the Rochester Regional Coalition Against Human Trafficking recommits itself to eradicating human trafficking by continuing to increase awareness in our community, supporting organizations dedicated to helping victims of sex, domestic, labor, and child trafficking, and advocating for change through legislation. Today, we are asking the community to pay attention and learn more about these problems. Let's stop saying, not in my community. Let's stop saying it's in Asia, it's in Africa. Instead, let's say, yes, here. Yes, here in Rochester. Yes, here in Brighton, in Penfield, in Pittsburgh, in Fairport, in Greece, in Gates, in Irondequoit, in Victor, in East Rochester, and in your local hotels, in individuals' homes, truck stops, on farms, and on the internet. And we know that there's been a lot of increased technology use during this time for trafficking. Yes, here we speak truth to power. I would also like to thank everyone for coming. If the media is here, I would like them to continue to cover the topic with more intensity because the human trafficking still exists and it has not slowed down because of the pandemic. And I would like to thank all our elected officials, coalition members, community members, and countless individuals who have donated over the last 7 years. Thank you for joining us for this proclamation. Please stay for our roundtable discussion if you have time, and I thank you for being here.
Yes, thank you so much. Oh, go on.
So I know, yeah.
Thank
we
you for
ended a
having
little.
me, folks. I got to go, but thank you. It was very, very interesting. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. I just wanted to add that we're going to be the roundtable portion of this, where we will be discussing legislative needs and priorities for trafficking victims, will be starting promptly at 10 a.m. You can follow this link in. We did something similar last year. People found it very, very educational. We've got a great list of panelists. So if you want to reconvene at 10 o'clock, that is fantastic. Meanwhile, take the time right now to get a drink of water and do what you have to do. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate you having me. It's so important.
Appreciate everyone
Thank you for your
coming.
time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Yep,
You
bye-bye.
too. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to the Rochester Regional Coalition Against Human Trafficking second annual roundtable discussion. We did our first roundtable discussion last year, and we are continuing that conversation. So I want to thank everyone for being here, everyone that stayed on, and everyone that's joining us today, essentially, and all the panelists for being here. And I am going to turn it over to Janelle, and she can go ahead and introduce the panelists, and then I'll kind of jump back in.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. So I am very excited to introduce our panel for today. Lots of talent and knowledge here. So I have some bios for some of you, but I am going to allow all of you to introduce yourselves, add anything that I do not add after I introduce everybody. So first up, we have Melanie Blow. She, as she said before, she's the Chief Operations Officer for the Stop Abuse Campaign, which is a national organization that prevents adverse childhood experiences through public education and public policy. As a member of our steering committee, she uses her experience to help RCAP manage its media and communications goals. Melanie also sits on the Trauma Informed Community Initiative of Western New York, the Downstate Crime Victims Coalition, and is a member of the Public Policy Committee of the Association of Professionals Against Child Abuse. Thank you, Melanie. And next we have Alfonsina Decino. After her, we have Jane Biggleson. She is the VP of Advocacy at Covenant House, New York, CHNY for short, which is New York City's largest provider of services to youth ages 16 to 24 who are experiencing homelessness and or commercial sexual exploitation. She founded CHNY's Anti-Human Trafficking Department in 2014, which includes services at CHNY's main shelter and a safe house where survivors can heal and thrive. Prior to her work at CHNY, Jane was the Director of Legislative Affairs at the New York City Bar Association for 8 years. At the City Bar, Jane advocated for New York State's first anti-trafficking law and a safe harbor law for child victims of commercial sexual exploitation. So thank you. And after her, we have Esperanza Fonseca, as well as Christian Eduardo. He is a survivor, an advocate, and an engineer. He is the co-founder of United Immigrants of New York, a survivor leader at Sanctuary for Families, and has involvement in many other councils and organizations. So thank you. And last up, we have Alexi Myers. She is a human rights attorney. She's a service provider and advocate for survivors of different types of gender violence, such as sex trafficking and domestic violence. So thank you all. I will turn it over to the panel. Feel free, we will start with Melanie if you would like to introduce yourself and add anything that I did not.
Nope, I think you got it. Thank you.
So I just wanted to give a few updates. So just some, we're going to ask about 4 or 5 questions to the panel. What we know is that while sex trafficking is oftentimes, you know, sex trafficking has gained a lot of awareness and recognition as a human rights violation, but commonly accepted that those who buy and sell traffic victims are criminals, and those who are trafficked are victims, not criminals. And while sex trafficking is closely linked, or have been said that there's a close association to prostitution, or often overlapping, there is less consensus on how governments should really be responding to that prostitution that involves adults. So there has been some discussion about various ways and laws to respond to addressing this. And so there has been 4 primary legal models that have been introduced and really emerged. And those include criminalization, partial decriminalization, full criminalization, and legalization. So when we think about criminalization, we're thinking of all aspects of prostitution is by far the most common legislative approach. States may vary on the degree of punishment for each individual involved and characteristics of the crime, but technically all participants are legally culpable for their actions. When we talk about partial decriminalization, the model we think about commonly is the Nordic model. Partial decriminalization really identifies prostituted individuals as victims and protects them from legal penalties. So buying or facilitating the sale of sexual services remain criminalized, often with increased penalties. When we talk about full decriminalization, it actually essentially removes all laws prohibiting and regulating prostitution, including those against facilitating and buying. Other laws include those against sex trafficking, child exploitation, and public indecency still apply. And legalization differs from decriminalization in that prostitution is legal, but regulated and controlled by the government. These controls may include licensing, zoning, and mandatory health checks. So with that being said, this year, New York legislators has been faced with 3 choices concerning the legal status of prostitution. Maintaining the status quo, whether that's full criminalization, partial decriminalization, similar to the Nordic models we talked about, in which selling of sex is decriminalized and purchase remains illegal, and full decriminalization in which both sale and purchase are decriminalized. So my question to the panel is, in your personal and professional experience, how do you think either change from our current model will affect trafficking victims? And I'll start that question off with Melanie.
Oh, thanks. Okay. Well, thank you for that, Celia. So one of the things last year, this was the state legislator announced a bill was going to be introduced to fully decriminalize both the purchase and sale of commercial sex in New York State. And so this kind of took this coalition by surprise a little bit. We did very, 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 very extensive research on this. And one of the things we found is that every place that has tried this, every city or county, as we see in Nevada in the United States, every other country that's done this, when we legalize or decriminalize any piece of it, the demand for illegal and unregulated commercial sex continues to skyrocket. This is not good. This leads to an increase in trafficking. We also know that commercial sex is a fate that typically befalls the most disadvantaged people in any community, whether they are identified as trafficking victims or not, this is still something that befalls sex abuse survivors, child abuse survivors, people who grow up in foster care, other marginalized populations. So there any ostensible advantages, such as reduced involvement with the criminal justice system that you could see in a full legalization model, those get captured in a Nordic model. So we get to see the improved quality of life that way. We get to see the reduced involvement with the criminal justice system that way. But we don't see the skyrocketing demand that we've seen in other countries that have done full legalization or full decriminalization. And I think everybody else on the panel is going to have something to say about that as well.
I'll jump in. I'm Jane from Covenant House. I agree with what Melanie said 100%. And I know that Christian and I believe Esperanza do as well, both in my work at Covenant House and in various coalitions, including the New York State Anti-Trafficking Coalition, New Yorkers for the Equality Model that Christian is also a part of. We agree, are full proponents for the Nordic model, which we've renamed the Equality Model, and are very much against the full decriminalization of prostitution. Just to fill in some of the details with, because Melanie got that exactly on point. All the research shows that human trafficking increases when you fully decriminalize prostitution. And one is I like to look at potential sex buyers in 3 different groups. There are some people who are never going to purchase sex no matter what, right? They agree with us. They don't think it's moral. They love their spouses. For whatever reason, they're not going to purchase sex. And there is a group of people that are going to purchase sex no matter what, whether or not it is legal. But there's a third group of people that would be purchasing sex, but for the fact it's illegal, right? They don't want to get arrested. They don't want to. So if it becomes decriminalized, you're going to put a huge third group of people with all that money into the sex trade. Yet there's no reason to believe that there'll be an increase in people willing to sell sex. So what that does is it creates all this money, and pimps and traffickers aren't going to say, oh, well, we're just going to leave that money on the table. Instead, they're going to do everything in their power to recruit and lure vulnerable people in the sex trade. So everything has shown that trafficking increases when you fully decriminalize. That said, on the other side, just like Melanie was saying, most people in the sex trade are either victims of human trafficking or very vulnerable, marginalized people. So people say, they deserve housing, not handcuffs. We 100% agree. There is no reason to ever arrest or criminalize someone selling sex. So the equality model, which is going to be introduced in the New York State legislature any day now, actually provides social services for people who want to leave the sex trade, which is not something that the full decriminalization bill does. And I could talk all day on this. Christiane, I know could talk all day on this, but just real quick to summarize too, I do believe people who are pushing for full decriminalization believe that you can very easily divide those who are consensually selling sex and those who are not. And in my work at Covenant House, I see that that's extremely difficult. Many young people will come to my office and tell me, Miss Jane, this is my choice. I want to do it. Leave me alone. But then a year later, they come back to my office saying, you know what? I don't really know if it was my choice. I was in love with him and he made me do it. And they realized that they were being exploited. I also haven't seen any difference in the mental health symptoms of people who've engaged in commercial sex, whether through the trafficking definition or quote unquote consensually. The degrees of PTSD, low self-esteem, anxiety are the same in both groups. So for those reasons, and then just every day, I see how vicious, how these traffickers and pimps try to recruit the vulnerable young people I work with. So I just don't understand why anyone would want to give them a free pass.
Yeah, I guess I can add some to that next. So good morning, everyone. I am actually a survivor of the sex trade. I've been, exited for a little under 3 years now. And I think that I can really speak to the point that whether, you know, you are supposedly in the sex trade consensually, or whether, you know, you fit the legal definition of trafficking, the sex trade as an entire industry has really harmful effects on our mental health and our physical health that often last years, if not decades after leaving it. And so, you know, being someone who was a transgender woman in the sex trade, and who dealt with, you know, the issues that it exposed me to, both, you know, sexual and physical violence, homelessness. After leaving the sex trade and doing my own research, I really came to support the equality model as currently the only legal framework that I believe really helps those who are currently in the trade. And let me explain a little bit why. The first is that we know that, you know, criminalizing people who are exploited by an unjust system doesn't work, right? It just, you know, adds more to their trauma, and it's hurting people that actually need help and resources. However, the full decriminalization advocates attempt to paint pimps, traffickers, and sex buyers as if they are, you know, just sort of like anyone else, right? Like, you know, they're just a customer, like going, you know, to lunch to buy their food. But the reality is, and I can tell you this from my own experience, and also if you look at the research, is that sex buyers don't really care if you've been trafficked or not. They don't care if you're only doing this because if you don't have sex with them for money, you will lose your housing tomorrow or not be able to put food on the table. They only care about one thing, and that is their own self-gratification or their own pleasure. And so what I found about, you know, advocates of full decriminalization that make me so uneasy is that they often try to cover up and hide the coercion and the violence in the industry. So I'm sure some of you have heard of the organization SWAP, right? Sex Worker Outreach Project. Well, if you look at the FAQ section of their website, they have this sort of like myth busting page. And they say that while some people think that, you know, there are minors in the sex trade that are, you know, coerced into it, they argue that only a small percentage of minors in the sex trade are coerced. Now, let me ask you, does that make sense? If we believe that a minor cannot consent to sex, then why do we believe that they can consent to the sex trade, right? So that's what sort of didn't sit so easy with me. I have friends who are, you know, currently still in the sex trade because they can't leave it. You know, one of my friends, she started at 16 years old. She was a foster child and had to do it to survive because she was facing abuse in her home. And now she's around my age. She's never had another job. And because we don't live in an equality model state, there's no programs that can actually help her exit. The right to exit is the most denied right to women. You know, whether it's exiting the sex trade, exiting a violent relationship or marriage, or, you know, even when you look at the pop singer Kesha, who couldn't exit a contract with a man who sexually abused her. The equality model is the only legal model that gives women and all people in the sex trade the right to exit. You know, after experiencing sexual violence, I wanted to leave. I didn't want to do it anymore. But my mom ended up getting a, you know, misdiagnosis of cancer. And if I left the sex trade, I would have been homeless. And so I had to keep doing it. And when you look at states or nations that have legalized it or fully decriminalized it, as someone else said earlier, they don't focus on providing right to exit services because it's just a job like anything else. But I think we can all recognize that while, you know, some of us have to work a job as a line cook or maybe a job we don't like, it's not the same as being forced to have sex in order to survive. And I think for that reason, we need to decriminalize the exploited, but continue holding the exploiters accountable and really focus on providing right to exit services so that nobody is actually trapped inside a world that they don't want to be in.
Yes, I would really totally echo like what Jane, Esperanza, and Melanie have said, and I think so that we have been failing. Like even if now, like that we are trying like to fight sexual violence, like racism, homophobia, transphobia, and all these things. I think so that we are really failing on identifying sexual violence instead of because I think so that we have been like as Esperanza was saying, like a lot of people, and especially I'm an immigrant, I'm originally from Mexico, like a lot of people is being like labor exploited. So we have normalized labor exploitation. And now um, there are people who want to sound progressive that you are going one step before. Like now we want to normalize like sexual exploitation. And we cannot do this because we want to separate human trafficking and prostitution as two different entities. That's our biggest mistake. Like it's not just that people, as Franca was saying, like people don't just wake up and say like, oh, I want to give access to people that I don't know, people that I don't feel attracted to, people that I don't really like want to engage sexually, like to give access to our bodies. Like there is no one that I know, there is no one that I have heard their stories that they just wake up and do this. It's because the lack of opportunities, it's because the lack of choices that really make, and Esperanza was saying, like really coerce. I think so that we are failing so bad. And because I think so that we don't want to recognize that we are all part of the system. Like we know buyers, we all know buyers. Like they can be like part of our family, they can be our friends, and we have normalized like sexual violence on such a level that we don't get the ties like with patriarchy, with machismo, that it's not okay to access people, but it just because you have the money to, like we need to understand that we are feeding this capitalist system that it's telling like people like in order for you to survive you need to sacrifice something. And on the other hand, it's like if you have money you can do whatever you want without any consequences. So those are the things that we really need to understand. On the other hand, as Jane was mentioned, like any survivor of human trafficking is going to come in front of you and tell you like, oh, I'm a survivor of human trafficking. Like, can you help me? Or I'm a survivor of human trafficking and I'm so happy to be here. We need to understand that I was a victim of human trafficking, not only labor, but also sexual exploitation. So and there is such a different impact on how it affects your body, your mind, and this is not something that is going to affect you on the level that, oh, I'm feeling uncomfortable, or just like, oh, I'm working too much. This is like sexual exploitation has an impact in the body and the mind. There are going to be like long life, like you are going to live with this. Like people who are engaged on the sex trade need to give away the agency of their body, need to give away, like, and the thing is that we don't understand that by buying and accessing bodies of people, just because we have money and privilege, because that's the reality, we are harming our communities, we are harming our people, and we need to stop this. We need to stop this. It's not just about like two adults like having consensual sex. And it's so interesting that we are always like focusing these conversations on victims and the people who are being bought and sold. But why don't we hear from buyers? Like we're buyers in this conversation. I really would like to have a buyer come and say like, oh, I have the right to access the body of people because of this and this and this. Like it doesn't make sense for me. Like it's just like a form to continue perpetuating like exploitation, like privilege, and giving power who those who already have it. And you know what? By fully criminalizing the sex trade or prostitution, what it sounds to me is like, I don't care about you. I'm not going to create resources for you. I don't have the time to understand your problems. And literally, like, you don't have money. You are not white. Like, you are an immigrant. You are gay. You are a trans woman. So I'm not going to create resources for you. That's how full decriminalization sounds to me.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to add to the conversation, to that question?
I know I already spoke, but I just have two quick, is it okay if I just had two quick points off of?
Yeah, take as much time as you need. We have time.
Yeah, don't
Okay.
stand on ceremony, folks. This isn't debate in high school. If you have something to say, say it. We're all friends here.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to just, I mean, I agree 100%, and Christiana and Esperanza just couldn't say it better. But out there, where we are getting crushed on social media by people saying things like sex work is work like any other. And my response to that is, if it's work like any other, why? And again, it doesn't seem to make a difference whether the people I am working with, whether they've been trafficked legally or they're saying they consensually engaged in commercial sex. I find both groups feel like they need to dissociate to get through the work day, right? Whether through substances or whether to mentally detach. So in no other job do you have to dissociate to get through the day. And as well, a large majority have been already previously sexually abused. So I just ask him, what other job are you, the prerequisite previous abuse and trauma and the correspondingness dissociation and mental health symptoms. So that's just, I think, so important. And then also, just in my work at Covenant House, the pimps try to recruit the young people I work with every single day. Just last month or 2 months ago, maybe, we had to call the police to get two men who were hanging outside of our building, trying to recruit every single female identified young person who comes in. And because prostitution is illegal in New York State, we can call law enforcement and have those people removed from our area. But if prostitution were fully decriminalized, there'd be nothing we could do, right? They could build a recruitment center right across the street from Covenant House. And let me be clear, that's where they would be recruiting, right? They would not be recruiting white, entitled, college-educated people. They're going to be recruiting across the street from vulnerable young people, which they're already doing, but they'd be able to do it with impunity.
You bring up really great points, Jane, because I had not thought, I've seen that a lot on Twitter, especially talking about sex work as work, but I had not thought about the disassociation component of it. So I thank you for adding that value to the conversation. And if no one wants to add another comment to this, I would take a step back and take some time. If anyone wants to just add more to your intro, your bio, talk a little bit about yourself, we do have time to do that. So I yield the floor to whoever wants to start.
I would like to add that there is one part of my identity that has been weaponized in order to impose that sex work is work. So I'm a gay man. I'm part of the LGBTQ plus community. And I think so that we have been weaponizing our identity. The thing that we need to understand is that we are one of the most oppressed communities, like even here in the United States, even here in New York City. Because the lack of opportunities again, and because the lack of choices, we have been cornered, like, to engage on the sex trade. And this has been happening through generations. Like, there's no space where LGBTQ people, folks, can be safe because of homophobia, transphobia, and you can start adding more, like xenophobia, racism, patriarchy, and it's more and more and more and more. So the reality is that why don't we have like different activities? Like, why aren't we like reaching out? Like, why aren't we becoming like lawyers? Why aren't we becoming doctors? Why aren't we becoming engineers? It's because of that, because there are no safe spaces, and we need to understand that. Like, full decriminalization means that instead of fighting homophobia, transphobia, racism, patriarchy, capitalism, we are saying, no, okay, let's just continue feeding the system because it's their choice, and we are not really understanding that we have a play on that. That instead of that, we must be creating like safe spaces for my community, for people like me to really engage, to really feel empowered, to really feel that we are part of the society and not just being exploited by our bodies. I think so that is this idea of all LGBT folks we are immune to sexual violence, that because we are deviant, because our identity is totally related with sexuality. I think so that we assume that LGBTQ people cannot be sex trafficked, that LGBTQ people cannot be raped, like, and it's totally the opposite. Actually, in order to survive, we need to go through this. And again, it's just layer upon a layer and layer, and it's so hard because the narrative that sex work is war, they are trying to tie it totally with being part of the LGBTQ plus community, and that is not the reality. Like, giving access to your body doesn't equal to be part of the LGBTQ plus community. That's false. That is not true. And I personally, I cannot allow like immigrants who are LGBTQ plus that are just arriving here with dreams, with goals, and why are we telling them like, oh, the only way that you are going to thrive here is for you to get raped for strangers, and that's the only way that you are going to be able to thrive over here. Like, how bad we are doing. And on the other hand, I think so that sex work is war. It's totally like putting away the experiences of people like me, that people that's Esperanza, the people that all survivors are out there. Like, even right now, when we are having this conversation, people are being exploited and they don't even know. And sex work is work. Just remove away all that harm, remove away all that pain, remove away, and it's like, oh, everyone engaged on prostitution, everyone engaged on the sex trade is there by choice, is there because they are enjoying this. And while like 99% of the people engaged on the sex trade are not there by choice, we're coerced, like we're forced, and by psychological like coercion, or by physical force, or by needs. Like, we need to understand that if you are cornered in an activity because of your need, that is exploitation. And we need to really separate, like we cannot say like all activities are labor activities. Like sex, it's so intricate connected with your mind and with your body, that we really need to understand that no, like, if a stranger is taking your body against your will, because it's against your will. Like, people with money are buying, are removing that part of the agreement. It's not that you want, because for all these people it's like, I need this money and there is no other way that I can get this.
Great
Thank you so
point.
much for that. Thank you so much for bringing all of that up. One of the things I want to bring in, that just kind of going to echo what everybody said, but especially what Jane said about it. Full legalization would allow exploiters to set up next to Covenant House. The other thing it would do, and this is just, this is something that just bothers me on a very deep and a very personal level. It also would allow them to set up camp next to the child advocacy centers where sexually abused children go for their forensic interviews. And yeah, to just start a pipeline from exploitation to sex work is a very concerning thing for me as a member of the survivor community. That's a very concerning thing for me. It's very, 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 very hard for a survivor to get to a point where they can recover and can do other sorts of work. To have somebody who's financially motivated say, oh, don't bother, scares me.
100%, Melanie. And so they already, pimps and traffickers already try to camp outside foster care group homes, places like Covenant House, but at least we have some tools to try to stop it and try to get them away. But if it's fully decriminalized, we wouldn't have those tools. So why give them the upper hand in that? And then the other, just a small point, but I think a powerful point is, I'm still seeing on social media that fully decriminalizing prostitution is the progressive thing to do. And that just baffles me. I always try to understand what the other side is saying, but how does the sale of, and let's be honest, it's primarily Black and brown, low income, female identified people, how can the sale of those bodies to primarily rich white men, where is the progressiveness in that? And I've been asking that my question for a while, and I can't find an answer. I think it's a myth, but it's all over social media.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. There is nothing progressive about concealing the exploitation and the violence in the sex industry. And a lot of what the pro-decriminalization camp does is really just provide cover for the industry. And historically, when you look at where the pro-decriminalization movement came from, you see figures of people like Douglas Fox, who himself was a pimp and, helped even start a so-called sex workers union, in Europe. And so just a few points really briefly I want to make is that one, a lot of what you'll hear are these sort of like programmed responses, like sex work is work. That doesn't mean anything. When we're making policy, we can't just ask if something is work. I mean, indentured servitude is work, slave labor is work, child labor is work, but it's not work that we as a society condone because it's exploitative, it's wrong, and it's violent, right? So whether sex work is work doesn't matter. What matters is that when you're in it, you're exposed to violence, you're coerced, you can't leave. And we know this because when the economy tanks, prostitution and the sex industry is there to, be like a parasite and recruit the most vulnerable people. I mean, it targets the most vulnerable people. And so, that's why I really think that we really need to investigate like what these pro-decriminalization people are saying, because a lot of it simply makes no sense.
Am I allowed to ask a question as a panelist? I mean, well, I
Certainly.
feel like, thank you.
We're trying to
feel
keep this low key and informal, so yes.
I mean, so I think what we're saying makes so much sense, and I've been struggling to try to see where they're getting the progressiveness from this, because I don't see it. Why are they crushing us when it comes to social media, and when it comes to younger people seem to be buying the sex work is work and it's progressive, and yet I just don't understand it.
I think there's a few things, and I think that one is that young people think that like rebelling against sexual mores in society is progressive, right? Like, oh, I'm rebelling against like puritanical morals, even though those of us who oppose the sex trade don't do it because of some sense of religious morality. I mean, maybe some do, but like myself, I do it because I went through it and I know what the reality is and I study it now. And then I think the second thing is really a malicious strategy of the industry to conflate prostitution with trans women, to conflate prostitution with Black women, to say that if you're not pro-prostitution, that you're transphobic and racist. And also, I think that, we think that we could just sort of remove the stigma, change the name of something, and then we'll change the substance of what that something is. So if you don't call it prostitution and you call it sex work, and if you could destigmatize it, then you'll be able to change the power imbalance and the violence in the industry. And that's not true. When you hire someone's services, let's say a wealthy person hires a maid to clean their house. I don't think anyone would say that they're on an equal a relationship that has no power imbalance, right? I mean, obviously one person has the money and is able to hire the other person, and the other person needs the money, and that's why they're selling their labor to that person. But in the sex industry, the pro-decriminalization camp wants to hide that power imbalance. But we know that the John, the sex buyer, wants to do he has the money, right, to get off, and the woman needs the money more than he needs the sex, and that's why he has the upper hand in that relationship. But a lot of progressiveness nowadays isn't about exploring and resolving those power dynamics. It's about hiding them and changing the name of something, but not the substance. And I think that's why we see a lot of young people sort of like latch onto this without really investigating it. And then also because if you come out against the sex trade or critical of it, people will attack you. And that's a real coordinated effort in order to silence you, because they know that our arguments make sense and resonate with a lot of people.
Thank you. That was so
Yeah.
helpful because I've been struggling with this for a long time, but that answer made perfect sense. So thank you.
And I have a slightly different take on it. I mean, first of all, you don't need to really peruse headlines very deeply to see that we're not a society that thinks very deeply about a lot of complex issues, and has a great understanding of politics and policy right now. I mean, that's kind of obvious. We like simple answers. We like simplistic answers. I think the reason why prostitution is illegal, I think those laws were started in our puritanical foundations, like Esperanza said, with our whole mores against sex in general. It's wrong for women to have sex unless it's with me at the precise moment I want it because I'm a man, kind of thing. And yes, I think a lot of progressives are wantonly just saying, oh, that's wrong, they're wrong, that idea is wrong. And again, our discomfort with looking at issues deeply and exploring issues deeply feeds into that. And we also are talking a lot about, especially progressives, but at this point not exclusively, about harm reduction when it comes to things like drug addiction. Oregon just passed a very significant decriminalization of hard drugs with the argument that this is a form of harm reduction. Pro decriminalization folks are comparing this to compare decriminalization to a sort of harm reduction for sex abuse. I think, and I mean, that's a logical way of looking at things. It's wrong. And the equality model captures the harm reduction aspects that can do. But that's another place where this is coming from.
That is so interesting, because for me, actually, the equality model, is the frame that really implement like harm reduction in order to reduce like the demand. You reduce like the exploitation of people. But it's so interesting that you're mentioning is because, and it's again, I think so it's totally tied with us trying to separate prostitution as human trafficking as totally different, sex trafficking as two totally different entities. The reality is that sex trafficking is happening. Why sex trafficking is happening? Because the demand for bodies is so high that the people who are willingly like to sell their bodies, it's not enough. Like, so, and we are not talking about this. Like, I think so that we don't really understand that. Like, we don't really, like, even though the people who are engaged on the sex trade, they don't fulfill the needs of the buyers. That's why we have sex trafficking. Like, that's a reality that and nobody's talking about this. Like, harm reduction is giving more power to the people who want to exploit more people and giving them more tools like to do this and to continue like profiling our communities and like accessing our communities and exploiting our communities. And the reality is that the people who are engaged on the sex trade, most of them, they are homeless, they are living in poverty, they don't have access to education, to nothing. And even if they are engaged on the sex trade, any of these doors are open. Like, they don't come out of poverty, they don't access like educational opportunities and all these things. And that's a reality. Like, people who engage on the sex trade are continue to be there with their vulnerabilities. Like, the prostitution is a system that is designed to that, to keep you there. Like, while you're being exploited, like sexually exploited, it doesn't allow you to move anywhere else until like you're not any good like for the buyers, because that is a reality. Like, what happened when you age in sex trade? What are you gonna do after that? Like there is no exit strategy. Like, are we thinking really about this? Like, if we already the war is not safe for immigrants, the war is not safe for gay people, the war is not safe for trans women. Like, what are they gonna do if they have been like literally segregated in one activity without recognizing all these harms, and they age on the sex trade, and now what? Now what they're gonna do for real? Like, they cannot be exploited beyond that, because now you are not appealing to buyers, and you are not appealing like to being exploited, and so it's so bad for real. The narrative of sex work is core, because again, we are just like focusing on one small tiny part of the sex trade, and it's the small tiny part who are able to talk, because that is the reality. Like, most of the people engaged on the sex trade, we weren't able to talk when we were over there. We were just trying to survive, and that is not enough. While all the other people is out there thriving, and the people that is on the sector is just keeping there, like accessing their bodies, like exploiting them, negating all the health issues, like not only like mental issues, like physical issues, because we need to remember that buyers are the one with power. So do you really think, for example, I'm HIV positive. If I got infected, or if HIV was transmitted to me during my trafficking experience, I don't even know. Like, I didn't have the time, like, to say, oh, let me protect myself. No, because I was surviving. We need to remember that what we call agency, it's really the agency to buyers, because they are the one with power. They are the ones with control, and we are failing to understand this. Like, people engaged on the sex trade, they don't really have agency. The ones who are creating the system are the buyers.
That's definitely a great point. And we see that in continual. We see that over and over again. And oftentimes when I have these conversations talking about human trafficking, I say, traffickers are led by PCR, power, control, and revenue. And that's exactly what you're speaking of. So thank you for that insight. So if no one wants to say a little bit more about their bio, then I will move on to the second question. And we're going to take a quick pause at 11:30 so we can switch over recording, but I will let everyone know at that time. So the second question that I have for everyone is, where does the proposed elimination of New York State's walking while trans ban, which is essentially loitering with the intent of prostitution, fall into the mix?
Actually, it's very interesting. I call it that is one step forward, the equality model. To be honest, is that because we are recognizing that people who are being bought and sold, they are not criminals. That's the first thing. That they are there survivor most of the time, and we don't know. And just by how people look, we cannot criminalize people. That's the first thing. Second, the loitering with purposes of prostitution has been used to profile like Black woman, brown woman, immigrants, trans woman. So this law wasn't created to really like protect the community. And again, I think, so as Melanie was saying, this law and legislation was created like with a Puritan stance, like, oh, you know what, like, people shouldn't look certain way, people shouldn't show certain parts of their body. Why? Because it's against our belief. But the reality is that this law has been given, again, so much power to buyers, because they know that if they go to a poor neighborhood and they want to buy like access to someone, they are not going to be criminalized. The ones who are going to be criminalized are the ones who are trying to survive, are the ones who are being bought and sold. So the elimination of this law, it's essential, like, for, and it's one step moving forward to the equality model, to recognizing that people who are being bought and sold not all the time have choices, not all the time has a real path, not all the time are there just because they really want to be there. So it's so essential that we continue like understanding it. It doesn't make sense for me, like, how full product decriminalization, full decriminalization people are so supportive of walking wild trans, and they don't understand like what they are advocating for. What they are advocating for is just that, the equality model, to be honest. It's one more step forward, the equality model.
Yeah, I totally agree. In fact, we wouldn't need it if you passed the equality model because it's part of the equality model. However, since the equality model is probably going to take some time to pass, as everything does in Albany, in the meantime, it's really important to have this piece of legislation passed. And there really is no reason why this shouldn't go forward immediately. I don't think there's any objection to it on any side.
Thank you for those points. Anyone else want to add anything?
Yeah, I guess, of course, I think the most rational thing is always not to profile people based on how they look, right? I just think it's important to watch out for, the pro-decriminalization camp that will use this opportunity to later, one, conflate, arguments for decriminalizing people exploited by the sex trade into argument for decriminalizing people who do the exploiting. And that too, while right now a lot of those people might seem allies in wanting to help trans, in the future they will not be allies when they try to argue that our right place is in prostitution, where we will experience rape, violence, PSD higher than any other level, any other occupation. So just that little point I want to throw in.
Does anyone have numbers on how commonly that statute is used in anywhere in the state? I know that, and Alfonso, if you want to jump in on this, if anyone local has any idea, any clues, that would be great. I know that mostly in Rochester, they tend to use stings to arrest prostitutes, also to arrest Johns, although that's very lopsided, as one would probably expect. But how commonly used is that, is the quote unquote walking while trans statute that we have right now? Does anyone know?
Very good question. I know in New York City, they are trying not to arrest people who are in the sex trade. So they're trying to sort of enact the equality model, even though it's not already enacted. They are trying to focus on the buyers and the traffickers and not the people selling sex. But I think it really varies county by county and across the state. And my gut would be New York City has been so educated on this topic and they have these specially dedicated units that it's really been drilled in their head not to arrest people in the sex trade. But my guess is it's not the same across the state. But I'd be really curious to hear what is going on in the rest of New York State.
What I have here in New York City is that specifically the trans woman population in Queens has been affected on high rates about this. And why? And it's again, I think so that we need to keep in mind always that there is transphobia, racism, that because there is a trans woman that is also black or brown, police immediately, their first thought is they're walking looking for clients, and that gives the power to police to stop them and take them to the prison. And even if they are not charged, I have heard stories that police want to access their body, that police harass them sexually, that there are a lot of transphobia towards them. So as Jane was saying, we don't need this law. We don't need this law because it has been just profiling and putting at risk so many people just by how they look, and it continue perpetuating the idea that just by the way you look, that means that you're engaged on the sex trade, and that is not true. There's no way just by seeing someone that you can tell this person is just engaged on the sex trade.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we'll just go ahead and move on to question 3 if no one else wants to add anything. I'll go ahead and start. What impact has the elimination of cash bail, thus ensuring pretrial release for most people who get arrested in New York, have on trafficking victims, are there any modifications to New York's current policies that you would recommend? And I'll put this question to Alfacina.
When I was arrested for prostitution, I was always given no bail. I was not able to get out. And I always would say to myself and wonder, like, why was I never given a bail? Did I do something so bad that I can't get out, or even, even call my mom and see if possibly she would bail me out? But now that I'm on the other side of that, I kind of see why that happened, and that was so that the judge would see you. Because
Can you speak up a little bit?
Oh,
sorry, can you speak up a little bit?
Better now?
Yes, that's better.
Okay. So now that I'm kind of on the other side of that, I kind of see what was the reasoning for it, as far as maybe you were in jail just for the day and you seen the judge the next day. She wanted to be sure to see you, to see what was going on with you, because if you had a chance to make bail, you possibly weren't going to come back. And that would put you at risk of, of going back out there and, putting yourself at risk. I don't know what other questions.
Are there any modifications to New York's current policies that you would recommend?
At this time, I didn't even know that they were even thinking about legalizing prostitution. So, at this time, I don't. And I really, honestly, to be honest with you, would feel like, I know that a lot of people care in this field. I know that they do, but I know that a lot of people don't. And sometimes I feel like what I would have to say towards the justice system wouldn't matter, because I feel like there is a lot of corruption, and not only with prostitution but with children. And the way I was brought into prostitution was different. I never thought that I would be a streetwalker. I never thought that I would be addicted to drugs. I heard you guys talking about how there's a difference between being trafficked and doing it consensually. Now, at the time, in my mind, I was doing it consensually, but I think that's just the trauma and the sickness and you being in that survivor mode that makes you think that it's okay. Not that it's okay what you're doing, but you're doing it because, you have trauma. I mean, what led me to doing it was I had went through so much, not only with the justice system. I was in a domestic relationship, and it seemed like to me that, I was never the victim. In that case, my child was not the victim. Nothing was proven. I did not receive any justice. I received consequences for things that I did not do. And it took me a long time to realize that I wasn't the only one that this had happened to. And I learned this being out there on the streets with many of the other girls. And hearing their stories and hearing how they came about into this field. And one way or another, they were just so hurt. They didn't know how to deal with the things that were going on. And, maybe they picked up that drink or that drug that led them to that numbness that they wanted to keep feeling because they felt powerless over their lives and their situations. Maybe I'm just going into other things that maybe wasn't a topic, but I just felt like maybe that's what I needed to say at the moment. I know that there are, did I say that already? I'm sorry. I get a little, this topic, like Melanie was saying, is very touchy. Not so much. It kind of is, because there's so many different layers to it. There's so many different ways to get into it. There's so many different feelings of when you're doing it, you have the perpetrators that make you feel like, uh, you know, you're different than the other girls, and you don't have this consequence like the other one, or it took me a long time to realize I was trafficked. It took me, um, looking back and seeing how it happened and how I was coerced to do it, and taken out of Rochester to a different town, to a hotel, and being forced to stay in that room, and by another woman who I felt like this woman cared about me, because sometimes she would take me to her grandmother's house and she would feed me, and sometimes she would take me to the store to get me clothes, and she even took me to get like a tan. But at the same time, if I left that room, she would have beat my ass. So it's so confusing. If you guys understand what I'm saying, it's so confusing when you're in it. And when I look back and I think about this girl, I feel like even though she was doing it, I felt like she was in the control of somebody else that was making her do that. So at the same time, she looked like, in my eyes, she was the enemy, but in reality, she was a victim as well, because she was being made do it by somebody else. So it's just so much and so many things when it comes to this human trafficking field, and in this whole population, and people come in it in so many different ways. And and I'm just glad that I was able to make it out one day at a time, you know, and have a court that picked me up. And at first, I was in and out of this court. I was in and out, in and out, in and out, because they would, you know, I'd be in jail, I'd see the judge. Of course, you don't really even pay attention what the judge is saying, because the only thing you're thinking about is getting out, you know? And, and I was in and out, in and out. And I remember when the judge locked me up, it was for 16 days. It was the longest I've ever done in jail. And it was really like I was able to sit with self and say, and kind of realize what was going on, because I was so moving, always moving, right? You're always moving. You don't sleep, you don't eat, you're constantly looking over your shoulder. You're constantly in survival mode. So that's 16 days, and I'll never forget it. People ask me, what's the longest you ever did in jail? I'll never forget it. It was 16 days. It was the longest days of my life, but it really helped me to kind of think about what I was doing. So I'm grateful for this court. I appreciate the way they do things. I'm glad that I'm here, and that they opened up this grant to hire more people, because I feel like it was only one person working here, and there was no way, because when they do stings, they bring in, I don't know, 15, maybe 20 girls at a time. It's hard to do one-on-ones with women and kind of tell them the benefits of this program, and, that this is a specialized court, and, we're not here to punish you, and we don't want to put you in jail. And, we want to help you, get to the other side of whatever it is you're going through, whether it be, do you want to start counseling now, to chemical dependency, or do you just want to be independent on your own? I think that's really important, to give the participant that choice, of what they want to do. I don't want to take up any more time, but I hope that I was able to express some things to you guys, to let you know a little bit about what goes on here in Rochester. Thank you.
No, thank you
No,
very much for that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Definitely. Some of the themes that kind of emerged out of what you stated was, the complexity, that kind of, you talked a lot about the internal struggle that you were having, coupled with the social struggles, of everything around you. Then you talked about that kind of layer of psychological manipulation and that confusion in there. And then what the bigger role of what the system and the laws and the courts were playing, and how they, in a sense, also play a role in everything that's going on. So you brought up a lot of good points, and then basically letting us know that there's not going to be a kind of like a one size fits all legislation or a program, and things really have to be individualized to kind of meet the individuals where they are. So I really appreciated that thought process, and I'll let anyone else jump in.
Yeah.
Hi. Oh, this is Alexi Myers. I wanted to go back 1 second just to answer the question about bail reform. That do people?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so 2020 brought around some really problematic bail issues, and one of the biggest things was that non-violent felonies didn't qualify for bail. One thing that's always been problematic in my view as a prosecutor is that human trafficking isn't a violent felony, because as we all know, what occurs is absolutely violent, and it should be a violent felony. That said, it's not. It's something that we have embedded into our equality model legislation to make it a violent felony. I don't know if we'll win on that, but the actual issue that we had with bail reform was fixed as it was amended in 2020, so that now sex trafficking does qualify for bail. So we don't have the fix that we are after happened without needing to change trafficking to a violent felony. I hope that answers what you were looking for.
Well, thank you for that. One of the things that I'm like in the outreach I've done and the work I've done locally with trafficking victims, nobody likes prosecuting a trafficker because it's very tricky. It's very, very tricky, and it's very expensive. But sometimes I've seen them in the past go away for some other crime that they're doing, a drug possession or a weapon possession charge, or sometimes a domestic violence charge. Has anyone been aware of issues happening because of bail reform, traffickers getting picked up for something else and getting right back out on the street?
Yeah,
I haven't heard anything one way or the other.
I think one of the issues was with bail reform was that there was the fear that for survivors of domestic violence that their abuser was getting right back out on the street. But part of that amendment also included protections for domestic violence survivors as well. So I don't know if the problem is fixed, but it's better than when originally proposed.
Did anyone else want to add to that question?
Yeah, well, I would like to speak a little bit. Alfonsina, like, I just want to take the moment, like, to really acknowledge, like your courage for sharing, like, part of your story. I know that it's hard. I know that these conversations can be like, I don't know, they can trigger like a lot of emotions, a lot of feelings, a lot of things. Like, to be honest, a lot of things. So I really appreciate that you had the courage, that you were comfortable to share this. Like, thank you very much. I think so that no, for real, that is super important, because we are here. I think so that a lot of times we assume that when we are no longer in the sex trade, that we don't need support, and that is not always the truth. I think so that we are still very vulnerable as survivors of the sex trade, even if you identify as survivor of human trafficking or not. Like it's hard. It's literally walking on hell, and the reality is that you don't want anyone else like to go through that. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. And also, I would like to add, like, on the cash bail, that I think so that, again, there are two sides, like the sides of the victims and the side of the perpetrators. If we think about from the side of the perpetrators, we don't want them to be out there, but I think so that most of the times perpetrators have money, and either one way or another, they are going to be outside. So cash bail was affecting more victims, because most of the time victims are more vulnerable financially. So even sometimes if someone else was able like to pay the cash bill, probably it was a trafficker, probably it was another buyer, and you know that how we were going to continue perpetuating the system that, oh, now I own you more things that I owned you before. So this psychological coercion like cycle, it was feeding upon one another one, or, and I think so that what we are really looking with the equality model is to understand like these interactions, as Esperanza was saying, like the imbalance of power and control, and how most of the people on the sector are vulnerable, and that a lot of times the system that law enforcement, like courts that are designed to help survivors, at the end they just create more vulnerabilities. And I think so that we really need to understand that this approach that only law enforcement or interaction with court is the only way to help survivors is that is not true. There are really other ways. That's why the equality model, one of the prongs of the equality model is to really educate everyone, is to really educate judges, prosecutors, law enforcement, like police, like community leaders, about the harms of prostitution, about what is about this intertwined system between prostitution and sex trafficking, to understand that a lot of people are coerced, that a lot of people are there by need. And if we understand this, we can create with holistic solutions. Like here in New York City, there is something called the Empower Center, that it doesn't matter, it for real, it doesn't matter if you identify as a survivor of sex trafficking, if you identify as a prostitute, if you identify as a sex worker, if you identify, it doesn't matter the label. We understand that it's a system that is preying upon vulnerable people. That is a system the prostitution is a system that empowers buyers while exploits our communities. So the Empower Center is a place where people can access holistic services. And when I say holistic services, it's legal services, medical services, mental health issues, and it's a place where people can get connected with services without the imposition of being called, oh, now you are a victim, now you are a survivor, because that is one of the main reasons. And we need to understand that a lot of people are surviving, and when you are surviving, you want to acknowledge that power. I'm here because of my power. And when you call someone a victim or a survivor, it feels like you're removing that power is being removed from you. So to really creating like this holistic approach, when we understand and we don't label people and we know them where they are, that's why I'm supporting the equality model, because we understand that we need to meet the people where they are. But in order to understand this approach, we really need to understand that prostitution is a system of oppression.
I also just want to respond to Alfonsina's story. It was so powerful. So thank you for speaking out. The whole thing really resonated with a lot of what I see, but one point in particular, when you talked about how you didn't even realize you had been trafficked, I see that in my job every day. Young people do not show up at Covenant House saying, help me, I've been trafficked. Right? And that's why when the full decrim people say, well, we want to separate, yes, trafficking should be illegal, but consensual commercial sex should be legal. Those lines are just so hard to see. With my young people, they always start with, I'm not a victim, this is my choice, but later they come to me and say, I really didn't have a choice. So this belief that you can separate out what's consensual and what's not, it's just a lot more complicated than the full decrim people are letting on. And I think Alfonsina's story shows that.
Absolutely. I mean, like Catherine McKinnon said, poverty has to be considered as part of the setting of force, right? Like if the sex industry was truly this consensual industry founded on freedom of choice and autonomy, then the people with the least freedom in society wouldn't be the ones making up the majority of the army of labor and prostitution, right? And that's why we see those with the most freedom aren't doing it. And those who are poor, those who are suffering under racial, sexual, gender oppression are the ones in the industry. And so there is no freedom of choice in that. And we can't ignore that poverty plays a role in the setting of force.
I am so not the global expert on human trafficking around the world, so I'm going to be quoting someone else, so I hope I'm not misquoting. But in countries around the world where prostitution is legal, like if you look at Amsterdam, you do not see Dutch educated women, right, working in the sex trade. It is always poor Eastern European women who are brought in, and oftentimes, despite the fact that it's legal, they're trafficked because they can't get consensual Dutch women to meet this demand for money. So that's what happens when you fully decriminalize human trafficking and like luring in and coercing and forcing vulnerable people from elsewhere is what happens.
Great points. Did anyone want to add anything else? Okay. All right. So I just wanted to say that we are going to pause the recording at 11:30, just so we can switch over to another recording. And I also wanted to note that Senator Brooke of the 55th District also sent a video that will be posted on our YouTube and our website, I believe, after today. Maybe give us some time, maybe even tomorrow. But she was not able to make it for our proclamation. So I just wanted to note that. So I will, Janelle, are you there? I'll let you ask the next question.
Yes, I am here. I am back. So my question for the panel is, this year, of course, we're facing both unprecedented budget shortfalls as well as an unprecedented rise in homelessness. What options exist that can provide the most help for trafficked victims and those at the highest risk of being trafficked?
I'm going to answer that question, but I also, just before I start that, just want to go back to one more point to the previous discussion. And I think it's so important, especially because this is in Rochester, on, like, while we all seem to be agreement on we don't want to see full decriminalization of prostitution in this state, we need advocates across the state to help us get the equality model passed in New York State. I think that's really important because the full decrim people are just so savvy on social media. So we really, and there's a groundswell in New York City, but New York City is not New York State. So whatever, I hope when this is over, maybe there's a way that the New York City coalitions can collaborate with the Rochester coalitions, and we can reach out to more coalitions across the state, because I think we should be one unified voice instead of all talking separately. So that's just something I wanted to put out there. But yes, to your question, COVID has been very difficult for the young people at Covenant House, as I imagine for people experiencing homelessness across New York State. A lot of our young people lost their jobs, a lot of our trafficking survivors, a lot of our homeless youth. And I had a few survivors tell me, one who had been out of the life of prostitution for quite some time, saying, you know, she'd not thought about going back to the life in years, but because she lost her job and now needed to make rent, she was an alum of Covenant House. For the first time in years, she thought she might have no choice but to go back and take a date. So I think jobs and unemployment is key. Thank God in this situation, she was able to find a job. We were able to help her out with an internship, and then she found something on her own. But job and training and employment is so key. Survivors tell me all the time, like, Miss Jane, what am I going to do with my life now, right? My only resume is in the sex trade. Particularly our trans young people. They are at such high risk for the sex trade, and so many of them will tell me, Miss Jane, who else is going to hire me? What else can I do? And that breaks my heart. I think we need to all come together and work together to make sure that all of our young people, especially our trans young people, know that they can do anything that any other person can, right? If they want to be a doctor, if they want whatever they want to do. So I think we need job training and education programs for all of our young people, but especially our marginalized young people and our trans young people. And then if we could find a way to encourage employers to hire our trans young people, because the discrimination that they're facing is real, right? And no one in 2021 in New York or anywhere in this country should feel like they can't get a job anywhere but the sex trade. So for me, job training and education is key for the young people I work with. Also, I think stipends and particularly vocational programs that you can get paid while you're doing the vocational program. It's very difficult for a young person who's a survivor of the sex trade, right, to now tomorrow be expected to get a job at CVS or at the movies. And there's a time period where you need to heal, where you need to just to heal and to get on track. And in that time period, young people need spending money, because if they don't have money to meet their basic needs, guess what? Their pimp or their daddy is going to be texting them and trying to get them back. So I just think there's vocational and educational programs that are trauma informed and understand that a young person is going to need time to get on track, and that they're given money while they're in that healing process. That's huge. And then also housing, right? There are some short-term crisis programs, there are some long-term programs, but there's not enough. And there's not enough permanent housing, because again, as we know, trafficking and poverty are so interconnected. And how can you leave the sex trade if you don't have a place to live, job training and education, and money to feed yourself? And that is why the equality model really does put an emphasis on social services.
I just would like to add, like, I would love like to have more solutions, to be honest. I think so that we don't have enough solutions. That is one of the main concerns that continue like putting people in vulnerable situations. Like a lot of people now we have seen, like, especially now that a lot of people have lost their jobs, that they're homeless, and instead of deciding go to a homeless shelter, they decide to stay on the street. And of course, we understand that that makes more people vulnerable. Like not only young people, like young adults, like Black people, brown people, immigrants, like trans women. So, and I just want to touch on this because I know that you are working directly with clients. And when you work directly with clients, and they are young adults or adults, and they are gay people or transgender people in general, like they if they are immigrants, like regular shelters are not an option. When I escaped my trafficking situation, it was horrible. It was horrible for real. I was living in a regular men's shelter, and it's full of violence, and especially towards the LGBTQ plus community. It was horrible for real. So I just want you to keep that in mind, because for a moment in my life, I was like, I need to get back, like, to where I was, because I think that this is worse. And you know, it was hard because it was my choice. It was my choice to move from here to put me in a worse situation. So we need to understand that, like, especially for men and trans women, when I was living in the shelters, and because all the documentation identify trans women a lot of times as males, they are not allowed to put them on female shelters. So it's horrible. When I escaped my trafficking situation, I was living in a regular men's shelters, and there were like a couple of trans women. You cannot imagine the amount of not only like sexual violence, like transphobia, that these people were living every single day. So we need to really understand that we're failing so bad to marginalized communities. We don't understand like the realities that trans women, like gay people, and especially that have suffered from sexual violence, from trafficking, that have been on the sex trade, and now they are trying to look to a new path. Like the system is not designed for us. The system is just there, like telling you, like, no, just give up and go back to where you were. So I should just keep in mind that, like, because probably I know that in Rochester there are not so many housing opportunities, but especially when you are working with LGBTQ plus individual, I want to make a really emphasize on trans women for real. Like, try to make the impossible to put trans women on female shelters for real. You don't know like how horrible it was for me, like, to seeing it, and I was like just so tired. I was like, oh my god, like I'm in a bad situation, they're in a worse situation, and I cannot do anything. So just keep that in mind. Like for real, it's not an option. Like for real, if you really want to, I don't know, like, let's create more funding for this, let's work about more funding for this, but just keep in mind that like especially when you are referring your clients, because not all places are inclusive, not all places are trauma informed. A lot of spaces are homophobic, transphobic, and racist, and you know, you suffer from that, and that just push you like to come back to the life. Is and that is the saddest part, that all the system that are supposed to help survivors, victims, regardless how you identify, and you're trying to do your best, like they are doing actually the opposite.
I really appreciate that. Those are great thoughts. Really great emphasis on those things. I'm going to pause here for our next segment. So if everybody can just take a brief pause, and I will be back when we're back recording again. Thank you. We are back. So just to remind everybody of the question, this is a year in which we are facing both unprecedented budget shortfalls as well as an unprecedented rise in homelessness. What options exist that can provide the most help for trafficking victims and those who are at the highest risk of being trafficked?
I just want to piggyback a little bit to what Christian just said, which is so true, that it's so important that our shelters be trauma informed and inclusive and non-homophobic, because all of those things lead people straight to trafficking if they're not. I can't talk about the entire state, but I do know that at least in recent years, the youth shelter system is really working hard to be trauma informed and LGBT inclusive. Certainly, I believe all of the youth shelters in New York City, young people live on the floor of the gender that they identify with and feel most comfortable with. But that is in the youth shelter system, and I don't know that much about the adult system. But in general, like brain science is showing that younger people, like the young people I work with, don't want to be in a shelter with 40-year-olds. So I think what's upsetting is that it used to be the day of your 21st birthday, you no longer could reside in a youth system. They've now raised the age to 24, but there's not that many beds for 21 to 24-year-olds. And it breaks my heart when a 21, 22-year-old has to go into the adult system. So I think when we're talking about ways to reduce risk factors, first of all, we just have to make sure all of our shelters across the state need to get to the point where they're trauma informed. And come on, people, it is 2021. People should reside on the floor that they identify with, right? And I mean, we even have young people, because who are figuring things out, and one day they want to live on the male floor, and then they're like, you know what, I'm not quite ready to fully transition yet, and today I want to go back. And you need to be okay with that. So we need to make sure all of our shelters across the state, both youth shelters and adult shelters, all operate in the same way. And then I think we should consider getting more beds for 21, 22, 23, and 24-year-olds in the youth system, because a young person, even a 24-year-old, if they're given a choice between an adult system and sleeping on the street, they're going to pick sleeping on the street. And let me assure you that when someone is sleeping on the street, there is a trafficker ready to pounce. We've researched this. We had University of Pennsylvania's Field Center did a study. I don't remember the hours, so don't quote me, but within a certain amount of time period of being homeless, I think it was 72 hours, a pimp approached a majority of our young people, right? So they hone in. When a young person doesn't have a place to stay, there will be a trafficker ready to pounce. So we just need to make sure that there are enough shelter beds that are trauma informed and that are LGBT inclusive.
I would like to add. Oh, yes, Melanie,
okay.
you can go.
I just wanted to ask, do you know what the laws are in New York State? Because I know federally there was either a push or they actually passed legislation saying shelters could force people to stay with their biologically assigned sex. Do you know what the laws are in New York State with that?
That's a good question. I don't know, because I know that Covenant House has been doing this for years, that it's been, and the True Colors Fund is run by Cindy Lauper. We get training every year. So we've been doing this for years. I thought New York City, I think, enforces that it's supposed to be the floor that you identify with, but I'm not 100% sure. And for New York State, I don't know at all. If we don't have laws in the city and the state requiring shelters to go with to make sure that it's the resident who gets to decide what floor that they're living on, then we need to have those laws. My guess is we have them in New York City, but not state, but don't quote me on that. Does anybody know for sure? I think that's when we have to look that up. And if it's not a law in New York State, we need to try to make it so that it is.
Would Alexis be able to add any thing to that? I'm not sure if she can't see on the screen here.
I'm going to try to Google it real quick, so maybe we can get back to it.
Fails.
Yes, I see one issue with it, that probably even if you identify as, well, regardless your sex assigned at birth, with the gender that you feel more comfortable, they need documentation. A lot of times, trafficking victims, they don't have IDs, or they cannot change their pronouns on an ID, so they are forced to use their. I remember that in my case, I was using my passport, and how even if I identify different from my biological sex, I will be forced to be on this. The other piece that I really want to highlight is that caseworkers, social workers in shelters, they need to get trained on human trafficking. My caseworkers, my social workers, they didn't know what to do with me. I was an immigrant. I didn't have legal status. I didn't qualify for anything. By the time I was 25, so I didn't qualify for any program that age 24. And the interesting thing is that when I started looking for services, I was 25, but just for 1 month. So if 1 month before I was looking for services, I will qualify. But now, because of 1 month, for real, I didn't qualify for anything. Like, they weren't inclusive. Like, they didn't understand sexual violence. I think so that in shelters, this is a huge issue. Like, people don't understand that if you're escaping, because they ask you, like, why you don't have, like, in the intake, they ask you, like, why you don't have a place to live? Like, do you, and even though I think so that they need to be a training on trafficking, because they did to me a lot of questions that I think so that there were a lot of red flags. Like, do you have family here? Do you have friends here? Can you stay with someone else? Do you feel safe, like, staying with someone else? And all these things, I think so that when you put it together, and when you have been like really trained on human trafficking, you can offer better services and not just put, like, for example, myself, like, just in a space where I was surrounded by males. I'm afraid of, like, even falling asleep, like, afraid to go into the bathroom because there are shared bathrooms. So we really need to tackle this, like, to educate, like all these people who interact with people who are suffering from homelessness, because we know that they are victims, or they have been on the sex trade, or they are prone, like, to being exploited. So we really need to educate or train, like, all the staff on the shelter system.
Okay, thanks to Google, I found some information. It looks like in New York City, it's a clear human rights violation to not allow someone to reside on the floor that they identify with. I don't know, I certainly know at Covenant House, we don't ask for identification. It's the young person tells us where they feel more comfortable, and they can change their minds. I believe it looks like New York City is pretty good, and we consider that a human rights violation if you force someone to reside on a floor they're not comfortable with. And again, I'm getting this at Google in a few minutes, so I don't promise 100%, but it looks like, so New York State passed the Gender Expression Non-Discrimination Act, and that does say that you cannot deny the use of restroom, locker rooms, or other facilities consistent with a person's gender identity. But I don't know how that plays out in enforcement. Do you need ID? And I think Christian goes really well with, even if there's a law on the books, the staff needs to be trained, right? You can have all the laws in the world, but if the staff doesn't understand trauma and they also don't understand gender identity, so I think there should be training. Like we at Covenant House, we go a certain number of trainings per year, several LGBT trainings a year. And I think that should be required across New York State.
Yeah. And, I just want to briefly add a few things to this. So, as a trans woman who was in a shelter with other women, one of the biggest problems that I found is simply that there aren't even enough beds, right? So, I mean, there's so much wealth in this country. I mean, we know, it's the richest country in the world, right? We could provide beds for every single homeless person out there right now, but we're not. And we need to remove the barriers that are preventing us from housing every single unhoused person in this country, and specifically, in New York. And so that's one of the problems, is that even if you have the most friendly to whatever identity you have, the reality is there aren't enough beds to house everyone, right? And so when I was, after I was really actually brutally raped, I could not do it anymore in the sex trade, and my body just shut off, right? And so it would always put me at odds with clients who would demand I have sex with them. I wouldn't, and then they wanted their money back, and it exposed me to violence. But yet every shelter I called told me that if I didn't have a child, it was a 12-month waiting list. And if I did have a child, it was 6 months. And I'm like, what? So, it was terrible. So one, we need to, I think we need to frame this in two ways. One is the right to not be prostituted, and two is the right to exit. The pro-decriminalization people say that your human rights are only violated when the police hassle you after you've already been trafficked or coerced into the sex trade. And while we know that is a violation of human rights, right, to be harassed, abused, sometimes even killed by police, we know that our human rights are violated the moment that we have no other option to survive, but through the sex trade, right? So one is the right not to be prostituted. That means, one, holding pimps and traffickers accountable. Pimps are not just this racialized image of a stylish Black man in a purple suit, right? The CEO of OnlyFans is a pimp, right? Like, we need to start thinking more broadly about what a pimp actually is and not rely on racial stereotypes. But then the second thing about the right to not be prostituted is, our social safety net in this country has been withering away for a long time now. And so people have no cushion. They have nothing that they can fall back on. And so the sex trade, as one of the most, if not the most, parasitic industry in existence, is there to prey on people in the hardest, most vulnerable time. And so that's why I think universal programs such as housing, healthcare, job programs, mental health programs, which are not available right now, social services are so essential. And then the second thing is the right to exit. The right to exit is denied to every single woman, every single person in the sex trade right now, unless you're independently wealthy. And if you're independently wealthy, there's a pretty strong, if not definite, chance that you're not in the sex trade, right? So providing the right to exit means the moment that you want to leave the sex trade, you will have a bed to sleep on, a roof over your head, you'll have food, right? You won't have to worry about how you're going to eat the next day. You'll be safe from traffickers, pimps, sugar daddies, Johns, because they do try to track you down. I had that happen to me in the shelter. And that you'll feel a sense of security, because I saw women who I lived with actually have to go back to their pimps, and they had tattoos on them because pimps brand you, because, you exist for them to profit from you. Your body is only a means for them to profit. But they went back to their pimps because there was such vile conditions in the shelter that we were living at, right? So I think really investing into right to exit services that make it better to stay than to have to go back to the hell you were living through.
You said that so beautifully, Esperanza. It is so true. I think things are getting better in Albany, but I don't know, about 8 to 10 years ago, a lot of legislators did not see the connection between beds and homelessness and human trafficking. And so I would get frustrated because we would go up on a lobby day for human trafficking and all the legislators were so interested. But when we would go up on homelessness, like It was only interns that we could get to even meet with us. And the reality is they are so connected, because when you can't leave, like Esperanza was saying, you can't leave if you don't have a safe bed to go to, right? But also if the pimps prey on young people on the street. So if you know, and they'll do that. They'll be in Times Square. Covenant House is at 40th and 10th. Like, they try to get to our young people before they get to Covenant House. And they'll say things like, the Cov has no bed. Where are you going to go? Why don't you come to me? So we have to make sure that if we're really committed to ending human trafficking, we need to make sure that there are beds and services for anybody who needs it. And safe beds. You know, safe beds, trauma-informed, LGBT inclusive, age-appropriate, because if not, the traffickers are ready to pounce.
Just a little FYI about upstate. So there are entire counties in upstate New York where there are 0 beds, 0 shelter beds for women. An interesting dynamic in Rochester is there's 2 parts of the city where there's a lot of open air sex trade and open air drug trade. One of those parts, if you ask the women there where they're from, they're mostly from the rural counties that surround Monroe, which is where Rochester is. They're from Genesee County and Livingston County and Steuben County. One woman of her story got a little famous locally, actually escaped an Amish community in Pennsylvania and got trafficked up here. So the lack of shelter bed is an enormous issue in the state, and it gets kind of complicated. Janelle, do you want to chime in? Because one of the things that keeps coming up is discussion of job readiness and job training. Do you want to talk about what you've seen, what happened this year?
Yes, I was planning to, so thank you.
I figured you were.
So I work in Rochester for an agency called the Center for Youth, which some of you may have heard of. We have school-based services, we have runaway and homeless youth services, and I coordinate our workforce development program. So we are funded under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. It's a federal grant filtered through the State Department of Labor. And we absolutely, I mean, I see everything that has been mentioned, absolutely agree with what has been said. Jane, you were talking a lot about how important workforce opportunities are, and I'm very lucky to be able to offer paid opportunities to our young people. We can get them into career fields that anything that they want, whatever they have desired, you know, just open their eyes to see what the world looks like beyond what they've experienced, beyond what they're, oh, I'm sorry, the dog. I'm going to move real quick. So, you know, just be able to open their eyes beyond what their families have even experienced career-wise. So, you know, I've got that aspect. Also, Christian, I apologize if I'm pronouncing that wrong. To give you some hope at the center, we are soon opening something called the Arnett House, which is an LGBTQ plus shelter. So that'll be really interesting, and, you know, perhaps will serve as a model for other parts of the state. So that's fantastic. But in terms of COVID, absolutely, you know, very concerning with not only our young people in terms of higher risk of trafficking, very, very concerning for my young people that are gang affiliated. We've seen a lot more violence in Rochester, unfortunately. And a lot of people go right to bail reform, which I don't agree with that. I completely see how COVID has disconnected our young people. So specifically, I work with 17 to 24-year-olds, completely disconnected them from school, which has disconnected them from positive adults, and has really allowed them to sit at home, get more involved in all the street stuff, and a lot of crime has come out of that. So absolutely, you know, and especially for Monroe County folks, push workforce development, anything that we can do to bridge these barriers, which some folks in Monroe County have done a great job with. And I hope that there are initiatives that continue or expand in regards to, such as we have Isaac Heating and Cooling, an HVAC company, and they were really struggling to get new people, new employees. And so people with the county in the workforce development division had gone to Isaac and said, well, what information is actually needed for somebody to start in your business? And Isaac was able to come up with pretty much, hey, they need to be trained in these areas. And the county was able to offer that training to our residents so that they could go through an 8-week training. It still exists now, an 8-week training, so that we can have young people that don't have any sort of experience. They might not even have anything beyond their high school diploma. They might not have any job history. They might not have their driver's license, you know, those things. And this training offers them an opportunity to get into HVAC, which can pay very well, have fantastic benefits. And these are the opportunities that our young people really need, especially as COVID has impacted employment opportunities. You know, I think Jane was saying as well, stipends. Our young people need to make money while they are going through these trainings, while they are transitioning in life, whatever it is. So those are some definitely key points that I see for, you know, Monroe County, the entire state, to really focus on as a preventive measure to help our young people.
Thank you for adding that, Janelle. When we talk about solutions and options, and I'm a nurse practitioner, and one of the things that I am, you know, hearing here consistently is talking about the themes around the need for programs, the need for trauma-informed services. And COVID in itself is definitely a big barrier. And it's just creating also a vicious cycle, because what it seems like we're definitely going to be challenged with is actually having that appropriate funding to now allocate to many of these programs that have existed. So it just seems like we have good intentions. Many of these programs have good intentions, but without them having the adequate funding, and now with the impact of COVID, and you know, even our organization has lost over $150 million from having to stop surgeries, elective surgeries, that we're just seeing that, you know, there's just this additional layer of vulnerability. So I guess I'm just wondering, how do we come back from that for individuals that have been victimized? You know, where do we even start? I mean, you know, if your funding has been cut, how can we really offer those services? I mean, as an organization, we are a nonprofit organization, and we are trying to do, like I said, we've started a survivor fund, so we're trying to help bridge the gap in different ways. But we are not going to be able to help with all those additional services. We may be able to connect people with some of those resources, but if those resources are not there and the funding is not there, these organizations are also going to continue that cycle of re-traumatizing victims. So, you know, what do you recommend for that, other than talking to our legislators, other than doing the work that we're doing? What other recommendations do you have for us beyond that part to really help with everything that we're talking about today?
I would say that building coalition, because I think so that even if a lot of anti-trafficking organizations we know one each other, I think so that we are on a way separate from other nonprofits and organizations that works on different issues, like nonprofits who work specifically with homelessness, specifically with job trainings, and like LGBTQ centers. Like, I think so that we need to build more coalition, and not only by county. I think so that on a state level, because in that way, first, we can share resources, and the second is that when we need to advocate for funding, we can do it together and not just as an entity, like, oh, I need funding for my organization, because if we build coalitions and we are, because the reality is that we serve the same communities because of intersectionality and how human trafficking is tied to vulnerabilities. We give services to the same community that others organizations that think that they had nothing to do with trafficking, they are giving. So I think so that's the first step, like to really create this bridge between the anti-trafficking movement and other organizations, because I don't know, I feel that all nonprofits should be knowledgeable about trafficking, because if you are offering services or path like to drive to the community, you are fighting like human trafficking. So so if we do that, like I think so that we can get more funding, not only for our own nonprofit, but in general for all the program and services that a state like we have.
I so agree with that, the coalition piece. And that's why I was so excited for this particular panel, because I do think we work in New York City. Other people work in Rochester, other people work in Buffalo. We've got to work together. And that's, but on the legislative side, yes, there is a shortage of money because of COVID, but guess what? The full decrim people are getting millions and millions of dollars to fund their work. So that means there is money to be found, but we need to work together. I mean, every time I look at social media, I get depressed because I feel like there's a million of them and only a handful of us. That's actually just not true, but they're so effective and so organized on social media at meeting the legislators. So we have to find a way to get together. The funding from the state on both runaway and homeless youth and trafficking is abysmal, right? So yes, I know there's less money because of COVID, but they are still funding some things over others. Why are we on the bottom of the list? And I think part of it is that we haven't been doing as good of a job in coalitions and social medias and working together across the state. I so apologize, but at 12, I do have to jump off to go to a doctor's appointment. But this has been an amazing discussion, and I've loved hearing from all of the other panelists. So thank you so much for putting it together, and I've learned so much from Christian. Every time I hear you speak, I'm in awe. But Esperanza, this is the first time, and I've learned so much from you. It's been amazing, and thank you to Adelphina for sharing her story. So thank you all so much. I'm going to stay on, just listen for another few minutes, but then I do have to jump off.
And it's been a pleasure having you as well, Jane. Thank you.
And thank you for that. One of the things I think is I think the human trafficking world has not been great at portraying how connected this issue is to other things. There's still a lot of sensationalism that concerns human trafficking. People really do get there's like you were saying, Jane, you go to Albany for human trafficking and people are pushing over each other to talk with you. You go for homelessness. You go for child abuse, early childhood benefits, stuff like that. It's a very, very different conversation. So yes, I think not only do we need to work together, we need to connect the dots a lot more. And people still don't want to entirely, that's an uphill battle, to put it mildly, but that's something that the Rochester Regional Coalition is very keen on doing. I'm one of the founding members of the coalition, and that was absolutely one of the reasons why I wanted to help found it, was because I saw the attention, the passion related to this one piece of a lot of very, very big problems. So, I mean, we do have that to work with.
So now I really do have to get off, but just, can we make an action item from this? Like, are there similar coalitions in Buffalo, in Albany? And is there a way to get us all together to discuss this across the state?
Yeah, I think we should coordinate, start with, from this panel, coordinating a meeting, a next step meeting, and then we can try to gather some of the different organizations, the leads on that, and then first we need to figure out what we want from them or what we want this to look like, partnership wise, and then try to get different, connect with them for follow-up meetings. But I think we should definitely get a meeting on the books from this panel so we can generate some ideas.
That would be, and do you have contacts for the other, like, are there contacts for like Buffalo and like, are there human trafficking coalitions that you know of?
Yes, I definitely know a few. So yeah, we can talk about that.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
You're welcome. Bye-bye. So I had a friend of mine say to me the other day that, what about if we made kind of Rochester the epicenter for essentially human trafficking education? And as I was thinking about this, I'm just like, it's not just about education. We really need, so you educate all these individuals, but yet what you really need is services. So, it's just like, instead of building this separate entity out to kind of acknowledge that this center, or have the center be a part of their legacy, we need to do more as a community to allocate those resources. So I'm like, I don't know. It's not, for me, it's not just about education. I know education and awareness is key to even getting people to even know what human trafficking is. But after that, we still have to do the next step, and we really try to get these resources. So I just wanted to bring that up because I just was thinking, it's not just about the notoriety and trying to get a bigger establishment. It's really about how are we really doing the work that we're doing, and how can we improve lives and help people be sustainable. So I'll just stop there, but if anyone wants to add anything to that.
I just want quickly like to say that I need to jump off, but I'm so happy. I'm super excited. I like to meet people around the state, like to continue this work, and I cannot wait like to continue advocating this work. I share the website for the New Yorkers for the Equality Model. We are going to introduce legislation on this session. So, I mean, as we were saying, like it would be amazing, like to have a meeting after this panel. Thank you for having me. Thank you for all the work that you are doing, and just have a great day.
Thank you for being here. Definitely learned a lot from you as well.
Yeah, I also have to hop off at the hour, but just wanted to, thank you for having me on. And I guess just one last point I want to make before I leave is that, again, when people tell you that, it's completely a choice and made out of free will, just ask yourself that why, during the pandemic, employers cut 140,000 jobs. And at that same time, we see a huge rise in people, specifically women, resorting to the sex industry in order to get by. But yeah, thank you, and hope to talk to you all later.
Thank you as well. It's a pleasure having you. I just have one more question. So what else should we be doing to protect and elevate trafficking victims in New York this year?
Sorry, did you call on, this is Alexi, did you call on me?
Yes, I was just going to pose the question to start with you. What should we be doing to protect and elevate trafficking victims in New York State this year?
Yeah, I mean, my biggest focus would be on supporting progressive legislation like the Equality Model, like the expansion of the vacature bill, which is known as the START Act, like the repeal of the loitering statute. And there's another one that's immunity for people in prostitution who have witnessed or experienced a crime, so that they can't be held responsible or be prosecuted for prostitution if they report a crime. So really supporting those pieces of legislation that decriminalize and destigmatize people in prostitution while holding the bad actors and the exploiters accountable.
Thank you. What about you, Melanie?
Okay, if you can put up with a little background noise, my house is still being worked on. So one of the things, this is a little bit off topic, but one of the things that we keep mentioning as a root cause of trafficking is childhood trauma and foster care. The one evidence-based child abuse prevention program in New York State experienced a 20% budget cut this year. Only 5% of eligible people had access to it before. Now that's down 20%. So this is of some use to women who are being trafficked, have just left, or at high risk, because this Healthy Families New York, Nurse Family Partners, all these other maternal home visiting programs surround them with support, with trauma-informed support. They have people who try to connect them with services. It also breaks the cycle of trauma and poverty so that they're able to parent better. Their children are able to avoid foster care. Their children have healthier developmental trajectories. That funding needs to be restored. It actually needs to be increased. I don't care how bad the budget is. We cannot afford more of this. We simply cannot. These programs are evidence-based, and we have actually documented that unlike a lot of programs that save money long-term, but not short-term, these actually save money short-term and more long-term. So we need to restore funding for that. We do need just to remember that homeless services, addiction services, healthcare services, mental health care services, these are all part of the continuum that protect trafficking victims and prevent trafficking.
From our standpoint as a coalition, I think some of the major things that we will continue to do is, educating ourselves, continuing to increase education for the community through our different platforms, whether that's, the YouTube or social media, to increase the awareness about human trafficking. And also we will focus on, the advocacy piece and educating individuals about, and our members about the current legislation. Even if it does not have anything specific to do with human trafficking, we also have to know, similar to what we spoke about here, how, issues of mental illness and how issues of housing and how all these other issues also impact the work that we do. So definitely keeping up with the legislation and the advocacy, and being able to continue to have these forums with our elected officials to educate them about the issue, as we did this morning at our proclamation. And then continuing to be able to provide resources when we're able, and to connect individuals with the resources that they need when the opportunity presents itself. So those are some of the initiatives that we are going to continue to do from our end. And did you want to speak to any of that in terms of what's going on at Center for Youth, or just from your own personal experience, as some things that we would be able to help, how could we protect and elevate trafficking victims here?
I guess I don't have anything particular that comes to mind. I know that in terms of our runaway and homeless youth department, I guess that's why it's a little bit difficult for me to specifically speak about it, just because I'm less educated when it comes to homelessness, in terms of just legislation and all of that. But I know that our director is very much involved statewide with homelessness, definitely, as someone had mentioned, getting more beds. I believe that was Jane, and that's been a huge decline for our state. And I know many other states as well. There's just not enough priority there. And outside of that, just like I said before, just really the focus on workforce development. And in terms of the center itself, I don't really know. I know that the center is part of different coalitions, especially as it comes to homelessness. And I can't really speak too much on the effect of that and exactly what they work on. I know that there used to be pre-COVID huge legislation days, advocacy days where people were going to Albany, taking young homeless youth to Albany so that they could all of the elected officials could get a firsthand perspective of like, hey, here's what happened when I was in a shelter, or hey, here was the consequence of a lack of beds, and everything that goes into that. But I guess that's really all that comes to mind in terms of that question.
Thank you. And I just want to remind the audience that we know that human trafficking does not exist in a vacuum, and that there's a lot of intersectionality. So definitely, Eduardo really talked about how all organizations really need to do their due diligence and be educated about human trafficking, because if you have someone walking in for domestic violence, they can also be a victim of trafficking. If you have someone coming into your organization for child sexual abuse, they can also be a victim of trafficking. And an individual with mental health crisis coming in can also be a victim of trafficking. So we have to, really make sure all our systems are educated about this issue. So with that being said, I would like to thank everybody for coming to our roundtable discussion. We really appreciate you. Glad that we individuals were actually able to attend our panel discussion, be on our panel, and to share their experience and their knowledge. I think I have learned a ton and have a lot of great perspective going forward with the work that the Rochester Regional Coalition Against Human Trafficking does, and then really trying to this is all going to add to our mission of what we're doing. So I really want to say thank you for all the panelists that came today. We really appreciate you. Like I said, I definitely think I took away a lot of information. And I would let Janelle or Melanie, if you have any kind of closing remarks.
I'm just very grateful. Thank you all so much. Those who attended, as well as everybody on the panel. It's so important that we have all of these different perspectives. Those who have firsthand perspectives, those who work with young people who are at risk or have been trafficked. We have perspectives of labor trafficking, sex trafficking, people who are amazing with understanding legislation and what's going on right now with that, and just all the different arenas. I think it's really important that we're here together to educate folks about it's such a topic with so much intersectionality in so many, Dr. Celia McIntosh, you work at the hospital, you see it on that spectrum. Of course, in nonprofits, when we work with young people, we see it in that perspective. So just thank you to everybody for all of your words and thoughts. I think that we can leave this event with a lot of energy on how we can all collaborate as a state, and hopefully just continue supporting anybody who is at risk or has been trafficked with labor trafficking or sex trafficking. So thank you.
And I would just like to thank all of our panelists. My goodness, I'm so glad we got such good speakers today. I am so glad we're able to start building some bridges across the state. And yeah, as for what we have to do, I mean, this is really an unprecedented time in all of our lifetimes. There are very few people alive in the United States right now who've seen anything like what we are seeing right now. But the work still has to get done. This still needs to happen. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is right now. So we've got to, we got to do the things we know how to do and try to protect the most vulnerable among us.
Great, thank you. And just a reminder that this is the work that we're doing. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And I would just say that we're going to continue to collaborate as much as we can to expand, like I said, our reach and our mission and educating people, because there's a lot that needs to be done. And again, I would say thank you for everyone that joined. Thank you for the elected officials that stayed on. And thank you for just really being here and showing us your support. these videos will be on our YouTube channels and I believe on our website. So if you want to go back and refer to them, you will have them. They will be accessible to you. If you have any comments or feedback, we appreciate that as well. And thank you.